Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome to the Trees and Design Action Group meeting this afternoon on managing water as a resource. TDAG is a network and a forum that brings together people and organisations to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration, planning, design and construction and management and maintenance of our urban areas. TDAG is all about evidence-based information and knowledge exchange, and that's why we host these online seminars. We'd really like you to contribute and share your ideas and your questions. Today, we'd like to thank Water Resources East, Syria and SciWem for partnering with us on this event. We'd also like to take this opportunity to thank TDAG's core sponsors. TDAG is a charity, and if you would like to see our sponsors, they're on the website. Thank you very much for sponsoring us for this year. And we would also like to mention that if anybody else would like to sponsor TDAG, don't be backwards in coming forwards, please contact us. Last but not least, we would like to thank Birmingham Institute of Forest Research, BI4, especially the amazing Dee for contributing to our admin support. So today's session is on managing water as a resource, and I will very shortly hand you over to Katie Thornborough, who is chairing our session today. Katie was brought up in Hong Kong and trained as an architect in the UK. Katie's worked in practice and research and was a partner of a commercial architectural practice and a director of Cambridge Architectural Research for many years. More recently, Katie has a master's in food policy from City University. In 2018, she was elected to Cambridge City Council to represent Trumpington Ward. Following the boundary changes, she now represents Petersfield Ward since May 2021. And Katie is currently the Executive Councillor for Planning, Building Control and Infrastructure. So without any further ado, Katie, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Emma and Sue. It's always strange to hear your own biography. I wonder who that person is. I'm really pleased to have been asked to bring these three presenters together to talk about different aspects of a holistic approach to dealing with flooding and water issues in the urban environment and the impact that a TDAG guide might have. The guide itself, First Steps in Urban Water, Managing Water as a Resource, looks at the importance of green infrastructure and the need for efficient water resource management, and we'll look at that when we'll look at several aspects of this. Pete Stevens will start by looking at the TDAG guidance, then Emma Crossfield will discuss methods for natural flood environment management, before Ian Tetherington looks at sustainable urban drainage and prospects for new government policy interventions, possibly. Today's session is very important to me because in Cambridge, the lack of sustainable water supply is affecting the development of new homes and businesses, and possibly even plans for a new hospital. I only really became aware of the issue in 2019 when local residents and organisations drew my attention to it. And perhaps it was because as an architect, I'd designed enough bathrooms, kitchens, rain gardens and grey water systems. I realised that the choices we were making in our new buildings simply couldn't continue. The problems in Cambridge have finally been recognised and the government have established its own water crisis forum, but we still have the same building regulations in dry Cambridge as Ian has in wet Wales. Perhaps we can discuss that later. But for now, let's hear from our panel of experts. After each presentation, there'll be time for a couple of short questions if you want to clarify specific points, but we'll save the fuller discussions for the group Q&A after all three speakers. I'd like to start by welcoming Pete Stevens from AJS Flood Risk Consulting, who will tell us all about first steps in urban water. Just to hand over to you now, Pete.
Thank you very much for that, Katie. So I'll talk you through the guide. So I worked with TDAG on this as a researcher for the First Steps in Urban Water Guide over this year. So I'll share the presentation. So hopefully everybody can see the slides in full screen.
It's not full screen yet, Pete.
Sorry,
yes,
full screen now. Yeah, jumping the gun. I need to press the button. Yeah, so this is the overview of the guide layout. So presenting today, as I mentioned, about first steps in urban water. And so it's co-written by myself, Andrew Stevens, who I work with, Emma Ferranti, who's here today, Sarush Sharathi, and Sue James, who's also with us. And it was published by the University of Birmingham. So as the name suggests, this guide aims to give an overview of what to consider in managing urban water sustainably. And it's aimed at a variety of roles in the built environment sector and those interested in sustainable design, more generally. So the guide is laid out as a comparison of good versus bad, setting the societal and legislative background, key terminology in this area, and then an overview of some potential solutions, and then key elements to consider to integrate these solutions into business as normal. So this is just a first step guide, but we reference lots of follow-up material for those interested in the specific topics we talk about. And then we also have case studies in the final table at the end. So first of all, water as a problem. So if we consider water as a problem, the solution is to convey it away downstream as quickly as possible to minimize the interactions it has and hence minimize potential damages. So in this context, straightened river channels, combined sewer systems and impermeable surfaces make sense because get rid of water as quickly as possible. However, we're now facing increased urban density, a higher occurrence of extreme weather, and a huge increase in the range and toxicity of pollutants entering watercourses, from agricultural pesticides and industrial byproducts to toxic household cleaners. Together, these overwhelm our current combined sewer systems, degrade natural ecosystems, and worsen flood risk and severity to those downstream of these interventions. They also, as in the case of drought, reduce the resilience of our water system. Once it's drained away to the sea and salinated, it's not so easy to use the precious rainfall for drinking water or irrigation without great energy cost. Obviously, yes, desalination is a topic for another day, but yeah, not the easiest solution. So, for example, in the uplands, water's nearly always been available when needed, and I've spent the last 10 years working as a ranger for National Trust, so spent a lot of time up there, and water has never been considered a resource for the pure reason that there's so much of it. So drainage channels leading into canals, natural floodplains drained to increase available grazing land, all very common ground. But I've seen a change just in the last 10 years, and the changes have been obviously happening a lot further back than that, increase in summer droughts, resulting wildfires even in the uplands, and reduced crop yields as a result, because the system is not so resilient to change. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to change that one. The system is not so resilient to change. So treating water as a problem this way also misses out on a key opportunity, which is utilizing water as the precious resource. So going into water as a resource. So by taking an integrated approach to land management, both in urban areas and rural areas, and disaster planning, we can increase the resilience of our water supply in times of drought, decrease the risk and severity of flooding in times of heavy rainfall, and increase our supply of clean water for drinking irrigation. And as we go on to see, a lot of the solutions can do all three of these in one go. So in terms of the uplands, if you look at the top left of the diagram, where the rain falls, or where a lot of the rain is falling, so afforestation and sustainable land management in the uplands can help water percolate into the soil, where it travels more slowly than surface water and provides the conditions for vegetation to prosper. So this is creating the first of our virtuous circles. So trees and shrubs are increasing groundwater by helping water percolate through the soil, stopping compaction, especially in clay soils, so helping more water go down. This makes the soil more porous, and it also creates better conditions for more vegetation to prosper, and the cycle continues. So then in terms of drought, there's a lot more groundwater available to plants, so it increases the resilience. And in terms of heavy rainfall, more water is percolating down into the soil. So it means that there's less over surface water flow, so less water entering the rivers at one time. So renaturalizing the streams and rivers further slows down this flow of water, and it allows, crucially, sediment to drop out. So increased sediment loads are a big cause of issues in biodiversity in waters. And it also obviously creates a lot of material which is going to be carried downstream and potentially cause damage when the rivers flood. The sediment dropping out is also very important to make spawning ground for river fish like salmon and trout. So reconnecting rivers with their natural floodplains as well creates temporary water storage for heavy rainfall. It reduces the peak flow of flood events, which is where a lot of the severity of the damages can occur. And it also restores wetland ecosystems that support a huge range of biodiversity and filter and clean the water before it's slowly released downstream. So going into the urban areas, so the little graphic at the bottom of this picture. So peak flows will already be lower, and urban areas will be mainly dealing with their own water by making interventions upstream. Obviously, we can't. There'll still be a lot of water entering, but it'll be slowed down a lot by the interventions upstream. And then in urban areas, I'll quickly fly through these because we've got speakers going into these in much more detail. So sustainable urban drainage is one of the key solutions in urban areas. Rainwater capture and grey water recycling where appropriate, and increased urban vegetation, including trees, to utilise water improves efficiency of many subsystems, along the wealth of other benefits that we know trees bring. And there's lots of other fantastic TDAG guides for those benefits of trees in urban areas. So to break down into the key elements of things to consider to put these into action, we got it down to 7 main things to talk about. So number 1, treating water as a resource. So minimising the use of potable water by appropriate use of rainwater and filtered and treated grey water for things like irrigation. So we're really preserving the high quality water for high quality uses. And also not rushing to drain the water, considering how it can be utilised as close to source as possible. Second one, small changes have a large effect. So although it's often easy to look at huge scale change in order to change our society, the other way up is going from a ground up approach, which is to do lots of small interventions, which add up to having a large effect. So the cumulative effects. So this can involve, for instance, a sustainable drainage system might involve lots and lots of small elements, which add together into one big system, or it can just be lots of small interventions as close as possible to the sources of water issues, rather than, for instance, a huge dam at the bottom of a watershed. You could have lots of small interventions like leaky dams higher up. But I'll leave that for Amanda to talk about. I won't steal that. Integrated water management. So a key approach of integrated water management is to bring together a range of experts, so not just water experts, but a range of planners, architects, everybody working in the planning system, because as we know, it's not just water experts who are making decisions on these things that are impacting our water supply. So overcoming siloed working is a key element of this. For example, linking urban water management with urban heat reduction. So for example, urban trees have a cooling effect due to evapotranspiration, but unless the trees have adequate irrigation, they won't be able to evapotranspire, so the cooling effects will be limited. There'll still be a shading effect, but so by combining a system, for example, having a drainage system that involves trees means the trees have more irrigation, and then they can have those urban heat reduction effects as well. We can also link it together with green space provision. For example, an urban wetland could be integrated into a country park. So combining the fact that the urban wetland system, as we said before, is having huge benefits of biodiversity, it's helping store water in terms of heavy rainfall, but then it can also be a green space for those in cities where it's most valuable. And also a range of mental health benefits from connection to nature and to green space. So although they each have their own focus, sustainable design finds a compromise between seemingly conflicting aims. So this in turn supports buy-in from a much wider audience, increases the range of funding available, and makes resulting interventions a lot more resilient, as the range of stakeholders involved means more has been considered before the implementation on the ground. So it's better to make mistakes on paper by committee first, rather than rectify them on the ground with diggers later on. So although specialisation, increased complexity of work structures, siloed working has become the norm, we can all play our part in changing this by just speaking more widely to people, being involved in more decisions, and trying to involve as many people and research as possible when we're making our decisions. Number 4 is using trees wherever possible. So trees improve the performance of many green infrastructure interventions, and also deliver a wealth of social, environmental and economic benefits. For example, those economic benefits may be in close proximity to trees. Cafes have been shown to have high footfall, increasing revenues. Social benefits in terms of mental health, in terms of connection to nature, are well documented, and environmental benefits of carbon sequestration, urban cooling, and biodiversity. Number 5 is use of mapping and modelling. So just making use of the available geographic information systems and hydraulic modelling software to help assess the most suitable interventions. Number 6 is designing with maintenance in mind. So having a maintenance plan in place before supervised construction starts is key. So this enables you to think about how things can work together to make the maintenance easy. And you can also identify crossover with other maintenance regimes. For example, again, in terms of green space, there might be landscape teams who can also be checking on elements of the drainage systems at the same time. So designing with that in mind to minimize costs and to minimize the interventions later on, making sure you can access what needs to be accessed without disturbing other things. And number 7, plan for SUDS adoption. So water companies currently have the capacity to adopt sustainable urban drainage systems that are predominantly used for drainage and used from buildings or their paved areas, provided they're designed according to the water industry guidance, which again brings us back to bringing as many people into design as possible, just to make sure you're not hampering yourself later on. So this will become a lot more relevant if Schedule 3 is implemented in England, which it is proposed to be, but we're seeing, again, I'll let Ian speak about this topic a bit more. And we've got the advantage that Wales has already had Schedule 3 implemented for several years. So Ian, again, can speak about how that's worked and potential benefits that England might get if that is implemented. So yeah, that was just a very quick whistle-stop tour of the guide, but the guide is available on the TDAG website by University of Birmingham. So we'll post a link for that in the chat, and or find it on the TDAG website. So as Katie said, if there's any quick questions, I can take them now. If not, I'll hand back over to Katie.
Thank you very much, Pete. I have one quick question. Perhaps you could explain what Schedule 3 is for everyone here. Some might know, some might not.
Oh yeah, so I think Ian will probably talk about this in more details during his presentation. But Schedule 3 is relating to the adoption predominantly of SUDS, sustainable urban drainage systems. And so it was part of the original act, but it was never implemented in England, but it was in Wales. So we can, yeah.
So we have, so we're asking for sort of just questions regarding clarification of ideas. I think Rachel Brown, do you want to come in and make a point?
I'm not sure if this is the right time to do it, but it might be better answered by somebody else. I don't know. In your experience, Peter, who actually takes on the maintenance of SUDS after they've been built in a new development?
I might refer that to some of my more experienced colleagues at TDAG. If there's anyone
shall I ask that
to,
in a different part of this webinar? Do you think that might be a more appropriate question somewhere else?
Yeah, maybe we can cover that in the Q&A, unless you want to take it now, Sue, or we can do it in the Q&A.
I'll just jump in. I think Ian can probably tell us, but does it not depend on whether the scheme is adopted, and therefore it becomes the local authority's responsibility if it remains in private ownership, in which case there will be some management company that has to take responsibility for it. Is that right, Ian, or have I got it correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I can talk about it later in my presentation, but yeah, there are different options. You try and keep it as flexible as possible to suit the site and opportunities, but it's challenging, but it's necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Okay, I think we will welcome and hand over to Amanda Crossfield, who works with the Natural Flood Management Programme and is a manager at the Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust. Amanda?
Thanks very much, Katie. Should be able to see my screen, hopefully.
Yep,
Yes.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. So yeah, as Katie said, my role is with the Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust, where I'm currently managing a DEFRA funded project all around natural flood risk management. So the Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust is one of 65 rivers trusts that work across the country to protect and enhance our rivers. We're charities and we're funded by donations, grants, a bit of government funding, and we also get funding from pollution fines. So I joined YDRT 6 months ago to help deliver the DEFRA funded NFM project called USWEM, and I'll speak a bit more about that later. And I was previously at Yorkshire Water as their climate adaptation lead, focusing largely on flood risk. So in my talk today, I'm going to provide a bit of context, build on the points that Pete made in his previous talk, and I'll give a little overview of the policy landscape in terms of how flooding is currently managed and funded in England, and then some practical lessons and insights around the delivery of NFM interventions. So I've made an assumption that this audience knows what natural flood risk management is. So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but it's largely working with natural processes, tree planting, ponds, scrapes, that kind of thing. And I'm also going to mainly talk about examples from Yorkshire, because that's the patch I know. So apologies in advance for my northern focus. So this photograph is very typical of the landscapes upstream from many of our cities, such as Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, Sheffield. And it might be picturesque, but it's what George Monbiot has perhaps controversially referred to as sheep-wrecked. So this land has been historically denuded of trees by our Neolithic ancestors in the case of the Yorkshire Dales, and in places like Calderdale and the Aire Valley more recently during the Industrial Revolution. And this land has been grazed by sheep and deer, and our sheep and deer populations are at the highest that they've been for several thousand years in the UK. And this grazing pressure prevents natural regeneration of trees and causes a monoculture of short-rooted, short-leaved grass. So we've lost that roughness in our landscapes. And above that pasture, we've got huge expanses of blanket bog and heath. And this habitat should be wet and spongy, but it's been drained for agriculture. It's had its chemistry altered with acid rain from our coal-fired power stations. It's been grazed and it's been burnt. And again, this isn't great for flooding. Further down into the lowlands, our rivers has been historically straightened. So this is a photograph of the Yorkshire Derwent. It was straightened in the 1800s to convey floodwater away from farmland. And straight rivers, as Pete explained earlier, have faster, more damaging flows during flood events than wriggly rivers do. And once those rivers meet our cities, they're normally even more enclosed. So this is the Ouse that runs through York, where the Foss barrier and the pumping station there manage water levels in the city, and they've just been upgraded at a cost of £115 million. So the approach we've taken in the past to managing flood risk was to control and convey water away as quickly as possible. And we now understand that this has actually reduced the capacity of our land and our riverscapes to slow and store the flow of water, and it's actually resulted in increased flood risk, especially with climate change on top. So we need to think about restoring those natural processes, because we can't keep building ever higher flood walls. It's just not sustainable. So it might be helpful to understand a little bit about the current policy regime for how flooding is managed and funded in England. And really the starting point for England's current flood policy was the national disaster that was the 2007 floods, where 13 people died, 300,000 people were without drinking water for a fortnight, and there was an estimated £4 billion worth of damage. So that event led to a review which was carried out by Sir Michael Pitt, and this review led to the Flood and Water Management Act, which was implemented in 2010. And this was a really useful piece of legislation that clarified the responsibilities of different organisations for managing different sources of flood risk. So the Environment Agency for flooding from main rivers, local authorities for flooding from smaller rivers, and water companies for flooding from sewers. And those are called risk management authorities. So the Flood and Water Management Act is implemented through our National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy. And those risk management authorities that I mentioned can apply for government funding for flood defence schemes using Environment Agency methodology and what's known as the Flood Defence Grant in Aid Calculator. So this calculator is a well-established process for prioritising flood schemes based on their cost benefit. And it's all about removing properties from one risk band to a lower one and the damages avoided. So under this framework, the solutions that tend to be put forward are permanent, hard engineering. They're supported by extensive modelling. And funding for NFM and SUDS doesn't really have a process of its own by which it can bid into central government funding from this Flood Defence Grant in Aid pot. And that's for a number of reasons, not least because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence for NFM and how effective it is, but it's a lot less mature than the evidence base for concrete flood walls. Also, that current regime requires a lot of modelling to prove that your scheme will be effective in reducing that risk. But often that modelling is expensive and it can cost more to do the modelling than it does to do an NFM solution. The Flood Defence Grant in Aid Calculator also doesn't account for the additional non-flood risk benefits of NFM, such as wildlife habitat and water quality and so on. Local authorities also don't have a remit outside of their boundaries, so it can be difficult to find locations within their jurisdiction where they can implement an NFM scheme. And finally, NFM tends to work where there's space to do it, which tends to be in more rural locations. But in those places, there are fewer properties at risk, and therefore that cost benefit threshold can be more difficult to meet. So that makes it more difficult. Oh, where have I gone to? Yes. So DEFRA recognised all of those kinds of challenges, and in light of that, they set up an NFM pilot programme in 2017. And they funded 60 projects across England, and half of those were delivered by communities and charities, including Rivers Trusts and Wildlife Trusts and other ENGOs. And so YDRT delivered 3 of those projects as part of that pilot scheme. And the photo here shows Bishopdale NFM. So this was working within the national park to install some scrapes. So these are shown in the photo here. They look like ponds, but these are actually normally empty or just have a small amount of water in. And then during a flood event, they fill up with water. And you can see that that's just immediately upstream of the farmhouse at risk down there. So this landowner was actually quite engaged with us and keen to work with us. However, there can be a lot of hurdles to clear when you're developing and delivering an NFM scheme. For a start, it can take quite a long time to find a suitable location to do one in, and you then need to persuade both the community and the landowner to accept that intervention. Many people aren't very aware of what NFM is, so that can take some engagement and education. It also requires changes to how land might have been managed for generations and result in a loss of income for farmers. There's no compensation offered for that, and there's normally no maintenance offered for NFM schemes either. And then working in a protected landscape brings its own kind of challenges, such as constraints on where you can do tree planting due to wading birds. So the learning from all those pilots has informed DEFRA's subsequent strategy and its policy, and it led to the announcement of the FCRIP programme, the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme. And that's a programme of 25 different projects across England. They've each got roughly £6 million each to test new ways of delivering flood resilience across 10 different themes, including nature-based solutions, property flood resilience, enhanced flood warning systems, and others. And one of those 25 FCRIP projects is my one, which is the OOSWEM project. So OOSWEM means the Ouse Water Environment Management Project, and it's focused on the Swale Ure, Nid and Ouse catchments in North Yorkshire, and those are the ones that drain into York. So our project is going to create and test a new NFM grant calculator, so similar to the existing flood defence grant in aid calculator I spoke about before, but specifically for natural flood risk management. And we're going to test that and use it to deliver, we hope, just over £1 million worth of NFM interventions on the ground over the next 4 years. We also want to develop and test new ways of doing catchment scale modelling quickly and therefore cheaply, and therefore enhance the evidence base for NFM, build capacity in the region for future NFM delivery, and then hopefully inform future policy and funding regimes as well. So in terms of our progress so far, we have developed the grant calculator and we're currently testing that. We've got the model set up and the scope agreed. Our delivery team has been recruited in place, and we've got our pilot projects that we're hoping to develop and deliver this winter. So some of the challenges that we've encountered so far in our role, so Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust role in this project is to identify landowners and work with them to develop, design and deliver NFM interventions. So it means that we've got to understand the challenges facing farmers and how a scheme is going to interact with their business. So perhaps understandably, most farmers want to farm, they want to grow food. They're not normally interested in covering their farm with trees or with building ponds. NFM schemes currently don't offer any compensation for loss of income or for maintenance of any NFM features that might be delivered on their ground. And this is within the wider context of a great deal of uncertainty around how environmental and agricultural subsidies will look in the future. So since we exited from the EU, we're no longer part of the Common Agricultural Policy, and DEFRA have had to rewrite all of our environmental subsidy funding arrangements. So, and a lot of those are not yet clear. So some of the sustainable farming incentives have not yet been released. The whole scheme is only guaranteed until the end of the current government. There's also emerging markets around biodiversity net gain, carbon sequestration credits, and green finance initiatives. So farmers don't have a very clear view of what options are going to be available to them either now or in the future, and it makes it very difficult for them to plan what's the best thing to do with their land. And just in terms of the calculator, it is based on benefits and not costs. And we are finding that there is a gap between the amount of funding that the calculator is saying is available and the actual cost to deliver that scheme. So we're working out how we can close that gap. I mentioned this before, because we're working in a rural location, there are fewer properties and they're more isolated. So making those benefits stack up in order to make the business case is more difficult. And also one of the kind of premises that we're testing with this calculator is that NFM interventions are most effective if they're within 5 kilometres of properties at risk. Yeah, so that's one of the things we're testing. So despite all these challenges, though, we have managed to find a number of landowners who are willing to work with us on our pilots. So these are landowners who want to do the right thing. They might have soggy areas of land where they can't really do much with it anyways. And there's also a big increase in interest in regenerative agriculture, helped in no small way by the huge increase in fertiliser costs due to the war in Ukraine and other factors, and a growing realisation that soil health has really been quite ignored for many years. And also farmers have their own desire to climate-proof and improve the resilience of their land. So this is a pretty typical field in the Upper Dales and a good example of where NFM could make a difference. So we've got a beck coming in on this bottom corner, and here in the middle of the screen, you can see that there's some concrete panels, and they've been put there in around the 1980s to divert the flow of the beck round the corner, and that was so that the farmer could cut this field in the middle here for silage. But you can see this photo was taken just after a rainfall event, and you can see that the beck actually wants to continue its original course across this field where that water's showing on the surface. Also on the bank here on the right hand side, you can see there's a lot of erosion there. There's a lot of rabbits in there. So all of that sediment's currently being washed down into that beck and ending up. So this is a good opportunity here. If we can compensate that farmer for the loss of income from silage and persuade them to re-wriggle that beck, we could provide a more resilient beck that stores and slows the flows of water, prevents that bank from eroding anymore, reduces flood risk downstream, and provides more habitat diversity as well. So just some final thoughts from me, really. So historic management of our rivers and landscapes has reduced their ability to store and slow the flow of water, but NFM is a great tool in our arsenal to help restore those natural processes, and it's got a lot of wider benefits as well. And there's also been a lot of progress in recent years in making NFM more mainstream in policy strategy and delivery. Notwithstanding the many challenges to overcome, there's still, I think, a lot of positivity about the future. There's a lot of NFM being delivered across the country, and it's just a growing field. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much. I think we've just had two fantastic presentations. Really, both of them so interesting. Do you want to, yes. Does anybody want to come in now for some any clarifications on the points that Amanda's been presenting?
I was going to dive quite straight in, Amanda, and then maybe I can see Rachel's got her camera on, so perhaps she has a question too. But Amanda, can't you, when you're costing, I'm thinking about the fact that there are a few homes in rural areas which are flooded. Can you not cost for preventative flooding downstream to make it more cost effective, like properties saved in York?
So that's kind of the idea behind the Use When project, is that if you do all this NFM in those catchments upstream, it should have a cumulative impact and benefit downstream in York. But that's what we're testing.
Thank you.
I had a quick little question. You sort of mentioned George's sheepwreck, and you showed a picture of the barren uplands. And I, in West Wales and places, look at a lot of barren hills. I'm sure we all look at a lot of barren hills. But for some people, that's the cultural landscape. You know, that is what the landscape should be. So how do we, and when you look at Guy Shrubsole's book on the lost temperate, the lost rainforests of Britain, he shows the whole West Coast would be beautifully sort of tree covered, and other places too. How do we actually get that cultural shift that inspires people to want to abandon the barren hills in favor of what the hills really want to have?
It's a good question, and it's something that is particularly relevant in our protected landscape. So in the national parks, where they're quite focused on preserving that landscape character, but we've all got shifting baseline syndrome, haven't we? Because we can't remember what those landscapes looked like 300 years ago. And I think it's difficult because the agricultural subsidy regime since World War II, I and II, has really driven farmers to increase production, and now we're asking very different things of them. And so, yeah, I think that's why we're in the place we're at, isn't it?
Learning unintended consequences.
Amanda, there's a question from Tom saying, are there any case studies available to view for any NFM schemes?
Yes, there's plenty on our website, and if you look on the Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust website, or in fact any Rivers Trust website, will have some NFM schemes. So there's been a lot already delivered across the country.
I'm looking forward to the results of your pilot projects later this year. Okay, Amanda, thank you very much. Would like to welcome and hand over to Ian Tetherington, Senior Advisor of Sustainable Drainage, Welsh Government.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry, a colleague's going to have to help me with the slides here because I can't get my work computer to share. So if that's okay.
Are they working okay, Ian?
I don't know what
Not yet.
No, that's I can see it's sheep in the field. I don't think that's mine. No, I know I'm Welsh.
It came on and then it started and then it disappeared again.
Yeah. Do you want to have another go?
Okay, so nothing's being shared, right?
That's right.
Right.
So I just need to find Ian's presentation again. Let's have another go.
Did see it at the start.
Can you see the slides now?
Yes.
Yep.
And I
That's
just
it.
need to share them full screen.
I can make them.
Slideshow from beginning. How's that?
Lovely. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I put two presentations together. I wasn't quite sure what message I wanted to give out. I'll give you an idea of who I am. My name's Ian Tithington. I'm currently Senior Advisor on Sustainable Drainage for the Welsh Government. Previously, I was a civil engineer specialising in drainage in Cardiff Council for over 30 years. The last 10 years, specifically on sustainable drainage and retrofit sustainable drainage. And in the last 5 years, Wales has uniquely had legislation in relation to that. If I go on the next slide, then I'll describe what we've been getting up to across the border. There we are, statutory SUDs, better by design. What was referred to previously was the Flood and Water Management Act 2010. It's a bit of a mouthful after the pit review from the floods in 2007. Schedule 3 of that act wasn't implemented by Westminster, but because of devolution, it was implemented in Wales. So on January the 7th, 2019, we were the first country in the world to have statutory SUDs legislation to meet 6 statutory standards. And if you don't get approval from the SUDS approval body, or SAB, you can't build. So we've had that legislation for 5 years. Very strong, very Puritan, runs parallel or independent with planning, and has been an interesting journey. Next slide, please. I'll just go through briefly, just to break it down from the terminology, because sometimes we're guilty of using too much terminology in our industry and no one really understands what we're going on about. So when we're talking to decision makers and politicians, I try and thin it out so everyone can follow it. So I'm not patronising. The 6 standards are basically, where does it drain to, manage the flood risk, quality, which is water quality, deliver amenity, deliver biodiversity, and the 6th one, which is always a difficult one, who owns it, who adopts it, and who maintains it. Those are the 6 standards. You have to pass all those in an application, a technical application, and if you don't get approval, you cannot build. There's no way around it. Very difficult to appeal against. So it's very powerful legislation, in my opinion, probably the strongest legislation that's been passed since devolution. I argue that when, with colleagues in work, but I think it is personally. Next slide, please. The key challenges, and hopefully, DEFRA through Westminster are going to deliver Schedule 3, an English version of it, next year before the election. It's going to be very tight for them, but we're trying to support our colleagues in DEFRA from the Welsh Government as much as we can. The 4 main challenges are trained technical staff. There is a huge shortage of people with knowledge of the drainage industry, landscaping, architecture, elements of this. There's a generational shortage across the UK. So it's really challenging to bring in such new legislation when there's a shortage of staff. What we're trying to do is to pass on the lessons that we've learned in Wales to our colleagues in England, so they don't trip over these things as the legislation commences. The second one is collaboration with planning. Where they set the SUDS approval body in England is yet to be fully decided, but the relationship with the planning authority is so important. They need to work very closely together from the very start of the scheme. At the end of the day, this is about making surface water designed at the start rather than the end of a project. So that collaboration is really important. Manageable maintenance. Maintenance has been mentioned over the chat. As a drainage engineer, if something is designed with high maintenance, it will not be maintained. That's the reality of the industry. So you really have to design the maintenance to a low and manageable amount, and preferably a visible amount. If it's got a cover on top of it, it's probably not going to be maintained. If you can't see it, it's not a problem. I'm afraid you have to design for human nature as much as you have to do with hydraulics, with sustainable drainage. And the 4th point is consistency. You will have divergence between the SUDS approval bodies in Wales, as you will in England. as you do within planning authorities. There is divergence and there's different interpretations. I think, though, having a little more consistency in the system helps people to understand how to apply and how to design. So it's a key factor. Next slide, please. Right, the benefits, delivering multi-benefits from the start. This is about doing the maximum delivery with what you can achieve in a scheme. You know, if you're just going to stick a hole in the ground and put a storage box in it, it's not really delivering anything. It's not delivering amenity. It's not delivering biodiversity. It's not giving multi-benefits to the community or putting up the hole being dug. You need to look at the opportunities you can afford when you go into a road, because we are facing climate change. We need to act now and not put it off for another generation. So it really does deliver all these aspects. And actually, from my experience, when it's done properly, it actually overachieves on the scores you suggest to politicians it's going to deliver, which from an engineer's perspective is completely the wrong way around. Normally we say it's going to do wonderful things. It doesn't go halfway there. But actually with sustainable drainage, it can deliver more than you think it's going to deliver, which is very, very unusual in my industry. Creating cleaner and greener places to live and work. This should not be underestimated. I had a developer recently who came up to me and said, "Oh, we've just done our first SUD scheme with houses." And he said, it was amazing. People liked them. People bought them. There was a different atmosphere around them. And I pointed out that they'd had to design the green infrastructure before they finished the houses, rather than the other way around. So when people moved in, it was sustainable, it was living. It wasn't cheap turf being bought from B&Q around the corner to stick by the show house and wait for it to die off after the houses have been sold. That can't happen in Wales anymore. They have to sign off a proper greenblue infrastructure. Again, referring to the issue about taking maintenance more seriously, this is always a question I get asked. Who's responsible? How do you pay for it? The system in Wales makes you put down in black and white who's responsible and who's going to pay for it and how you're going to pay for it. And there's an annual maintenance scheme that has to be signed off. If it's not signed off, they don't build. And at the end of the day, it is delivering better design. If you build a new site using SUDs, it shouldn't cost more. If it does cost more, it's a bad design. You shouldn't necessarily lose development density. If you do so, it's a bad design. You can actually design, make your money, and come up with somewhere better to live and work. And that's how it should be looked at. This should be the new norm. On to the next slide, please. I'm going to pop through a couple of schemes in Cardiff recently completed when I was working with the council to give you some idea how challenging, I say, retrofit, which is an element of sustainable drainage, is and what can be achieved. This particular scheme is a very, very busy city centre street with lots of tall buildings going up on either side. It's absolutely full of services, but it's been achieved. You could flick on to the next slide, please. Again, this is what it used to look like, very grey roads. It's very busy on the weekends. This is when you've got an event in the rugby stadium. And as you can see, it is spaghetti junction in terms of services. It's got absolutely everything in there. And yet, with this particular scheme, you can flick on to the next one. We engineered and designed around it. We worked very closely with the highways engineers to make sure they were happy with the systems we used. These particular ones are greenblue urban soil cell systems, giving 10 to 12 cubic meters of soil per urban tree. We've done a lot of work on urban tree design in the city centre. They're not cheap. You put fewer in and get better quality and greater longevity. I'm not a fan of sticking a twig in a footpath, sticking a little plug in with it and expecting it to grow. We need to design properly for long-term green in our urban environment to give these trees longevity, a good lifespan, pick the right species, give the right location. It's all very, very important to get this right. And in the bottom right, you can see the completed scheme where there were 6 elliptical rain gardens on the north side of the street to catch the runoff from the highway, from the footpath, from the cycleways. And on the southern side, there's 13 soil cell systems where we didn't have room to put rain gardens in. So we put in below ground soil systems. We took about 8,000 square meters of runoff out to the combined network, cleansed it through the soil and the vegetation, and let grass and gravity do all work, and put it in the culvert and plonked it in the River Taff, the other side of the road. So this one was completed a matter of 6 months ago. So it shows what can be done. And every year, this street is going to get greener and greener because these trees have got longevity in terms of their species, in terms of location, and in terms of soil health. Next slide, please. This is a residential exam that we finished this one about 5 years ago, another retrofit, Green Grangetown. When you retrofit, you consult and you consult and you consult. It's so important to talk to residents and talk to businesses. If you don't talk to them, you don't get a good design. Very, very important. Next slide, please. This is a particular area in Grangetown. It's the Dockland area, Cardiff. It's not the usual suburban area you often see retrofit in. Portland, Oregon is always the one they use as an example. These are inner city streets, many Victorian streets, Victorian houses, high density, very multi-ethnic community. And we removed 42,000 square meters of runoff, which is equivalent to the rainfall of Cardiff, about 42 million litres a year from the combined network, which was travelling 8 miles through 3 pumping stations to get tertiary treatment when it was 30 yards from the river. So grass, gravity and rain gardens are doing all the work. Nothing mechanical, it's just Mother Nature doing the work and doing a much better job. Next one, please. Again, these are the challenges: parking, parking and more parking. Existing trees, we didn't chop them down, we engineered around them. And it was so important to keep the canopy you've got and add to the canopy you've got. It's not the time in human races time to start chopping trees down. We need to keep what we've got, make sure they're healthy trees and add to those canopies. So, and the cycle route on the right way, we improved the cycle routes, we improved pedestrians. I don't think in a scheme there's been a road traffic accident since it was completed 5 years ago, because it's been designed for multi-benefits. That includes people walking, people cycling. It's a residential area with cars, it's not a car park. Next slide, please. Again, I talked about consultation, involving the community and also giving them options. We gave them options on designs, we gave them options on vegetation, on tree species. We even showed what they look like at different seasons, so you could have a choice of colour, choice of design. But at the end of the day, this vegetation and trees are designed for dry soil, rain gardens, and most of the time bone dry, and also designed for the climate. They match local fauna and flora, and also they're pollutant tolerant. So you choose plants specific for the purpose, so their maintenance is also low because they grow very slow, so keep the maintenance down. This was the 6th design on this street before the locals were happy. They weren't very happy with the street. I should say that because I actually live in this street. Never live where you retrofit. A lesson for everyone there. Next slide, please. Community pride, community action. It's so, I keep banging on about this. I can't overstate how important it is not to consult, to converse with local communities. On the left, we had weekend planting sessions for local communities to get involved. We supplied all the PPE so they could plant vegetation. On the right is a school planting a rain garden, and the central rain garden is the one that they planted. And it really means a lot to the community to be involved, because as public sector funding gets tighter and tighter for all organisations for various reasons, using the community to be involved in maintenance as well, as long as the health and safety and insurance is done, is something I think is very important. But you can only do that if you involve them in a retrofit, in the design and in the installation. They take pride. It's almost like their front garden. They take pride in it. And I think that link with the community and SUDS, particularly retrofit SUDS, is very important. And when Ofwat talks about nature-based solutions to remove water from the system, that is retrofit SUDS. That's exactly what they're referring to. Next slide, please. This is an example of what looks like when it's been through a rain garden on the right, and when it goes through a gully in the middle. The pollutants carried by highway drainage are frightening. This is a huge issue that's going to be the next CSO next year, in my opinion. I'm more worried about highway drainage than CSOs. I genuinely am. And the good news is that bioretention systems, when designed and installed correctly, those two ISID, are incredibly effective at intercepting pollutants, including microplastics. Research is being done on this at the moment in Cardiff and other areas. But again, they appear to be outperforming what we thought they could do in terms of catching and breaking down aromatic hydrocarbons, catching heavy metals, catching ethanols, catching microplastics. They are very clever systems, far better than any proprietary system on the market and less maintenance. That's why we need to use SUDS. Next one, please. Just a couple of examples, 2 final pictures. This is retrofit. This is a street in Grangetown where there's trees in the middle, not very healthy. They were cherry trees bought by the locals 30 years ago. They've been tarmacked up to the bark because people wanted to park their cars. As people bought more cars, everything becomes grey, everything less green. And we can have a picture after, and this is not enhanced. This is what the street looks like now, where we've put in the rain gardens, put in vegetation, added new trees, greened up the community, and it is a greener, cleaner place to work and live. And it's also doing an incredible engineering job in removing vast quantities of flow from the sewer system, creating a more sustainable sewer system, and creating new biodiversity. Each one of these rain gardens has an overflow with basically an amphibian ladder in the overflow. So if a toad falls down the overflow, can climb out again. It's that level of detail that you need to get the SUD systems right. That's the end of my presentation. Sorry to talk so much. Oh, tell a lie, there's one more. I forgot about this one. Well-designed and installed SUDs deliver flood risk management, water treatment, enhanced biodiversity, community amenity, and nicer places to live and work. As consequences of the climate crisis approach upon us, putting off such multi-benefit solutions is unsustainable. All such good solutions are a clever combination of civil engineering and landscape architecture. There's no such thing as a greenblue solution. There's always grey underneath it. So understand it's always a combination of the two, which is why the input from landscape architects is incredibly important to me as a civil engineer. That's definitely my last slide. Thank you.
Wow, Ian, thank you so much. Another really, really interesting presentation. I love the before and after shots of the street where you've retrofitted the rain gardens. But did you have problems with, did you have to remove some car parking? Because we in Cambridge, I'd like to do more of things like that, but there's such an issue about residential car parking. Were you faced with that issue?
Yeah, that's the first, second, and third biggest issues as part of the conversation. I think what we did in this particular instance is we prioritised residents parking for residents, and we squeezed out commuter parking because it's relatively close to the city centre. We squeezed out commuter parking. We reduced the parking density where it was dangerous, and we explained to the locals what we were doing, why we were doing. So they lost a relatively small amount of parking. The commuters lost quite a lot. What we had to do then is model the implications to areas further away. But commuter parking, they only are prepared to walk so far before they look at alternatives. If they have to park the car a mile and a half away, they'll find another way to get. So we modeled that to make sure it didn't have an ongoing effect on other areas. But basically, no, we designed everything to maximize residents parking. But at the end of the day, we kept making a point that this is a residential area with cars, not a car park with residents living around them. It's been reinstated to what it was. Kids can play in the streets again. Literally, it's a much less dense area. It's much safer. It falls under the new 20-mile-per-hour zone, which it's actually had for 2 years, this area, without a single complaint. Just thought I'd make that point in Grangetown. Could people feel safer, less stressed? They feel safer to walk, safer to cycle. It's a very, very busy cycle route. And it's inner city Cardiff. This is not suburbia. This is inner city, multicultural Cardiff, where the local primary school has 49 languages other than English as its first language. So it's a very, very, basically, I call it the new Tiger Bay. They've all come over from Butetown to Grangetown. And it's a fantastic place to live because of that mix and because the streets are greener.
Well, it's a really great example. Are there any quick fire questions for Ian? There's one question. It says, Ian, can you tell us what trees were used and why? Are they thriving in greener Grangetown?
Most of the species are doing pretty well. We used rowans, we used certain types of oak, we used maples. One species that didn't work very well was a silver birch. 2 reasons. Firstly, a lesson. We learned a lot of lessons from Greening Grangetown. There were delays on the installation of the trees, and the trees were delivered to site, and the root balls were exposed for a time, and drought damage was done to some of the root balls because the contractor wasn't aware that they needed to keep them wet. So we always have next day delivery with the trees to make sure they're kept in the nurseries as long as possible. And the second thing is we are finding that silver birch aren't particularly, they're hit and miss in a rain garden environment. Literally in the last 10 years, the climate has changed so much in Cardiff that we are taking some trees off the list and adding new ones. But generally, we try to use species that are found in the Welsh environment because the birds and the bees do recognise them, and you have that link between the fauna and the flora. You're trying to create green corridors from the riverbank up to a Victorian park in the middle of Grangetown. That was part of the plan.
Rachel has a point to make or a question.
It was just, I put in the questions actually, but I was just wondering if you had links to the research you were talking about for the capturing pollutants within the bioretention systems.
To be honest, it's being done as we speak. We've set up some research unit with Cardiff University. Previously, Welsh Water have done some work on microplastics with Morden Sindel. I think that was published a few years ago. I think one of the problems we have with these schemes is that we don't put enough money in the contract for research. We put some, I think two things I'd like to put money in the contract would be for research and for signage to explain to people what a rain garden is, because that educational thing is constantly important, but also research. So while it's being done, and I know other universities around the UK, including Sheffield and others, are doing work in this area, I think we're behind the times. All our research is based on US research from 25 years ago. We're now creating our own research because of the SUDS legislation. I think we're playing catch up in the UK, but perhaps that research has been more relevant to our climate and to our population density. So I think it'll be great research, but we're behind. And I think hopefully when Schedule 3 comes in, a lot more money for research will come in. But at the moment, there's a lot of students doing their PhDs on rain gardens.
So can I just ask one more question about the Schedule 3? I'm in Scotland. Do you know if it's going to be implemented here or if it has?
It hasn't been, no. They pulled out when England did. But Scotland doing different things with surface water in relation to management. So while they don't have Schedule 3, they are tightening up a lot on pollution and flood risk management. Whether they decide to sign up for Schedule 3 or not, I don't know. But at the stage, I don't think they're planning to.
Well, okay, thank you. So
Katie, I just saw a quick question from Joe Lewis for Ian.
Joe, yes, it says, does the soil become contaminated? This is about water that drains into highway SUDS features. Does the soil become contaminated, and are there any implications for leaching into the groundwater or even handling of soils for horticulturalists and groundworks managers?
The contamination of soil is largely dependent on the traffic volumes, because the catchments we tend to work on are basically between a 5, 10, 15 to 1 ratio soil to highway or road. Highway is the main problem, and it's really dependent on the traffic volumes. Very high traffic volumes cause very high pollutant volumes of pollutant contaminated silts predominantly. What generally happens, it gets trapped in the first couple of inches of the soil. Generally, if it's a single inlet within about 2 foot of the inlet, or if it's a flush curb within about 2 foot of the flush curb. We are monitoring it at the moment. A lot of the silt breaks down. The hydrocarbons break down naturally and work their way up into the bark and the vegetation. And a lot of the other pollutants are gradually trapped in the first few inches. What we're doing is monitoring the plants and monitoring the soil. At the moment, after 5 years in Grangetown, we've had no problems at all. I know some companies like Greenblue Urban and others are doing longer term research, but we anticipate eventually we'll probably have to remove a few inches of soil after 10 or 20 years within a certain area, but we're really not talking about huge volumes because it is encapsulated in the first few inches. The toxicity levels will eventually affect the vegetation, but at the moment, there's no sign of that.
Thank you. Rachel, do you want to come in with a point or question?
It's a question, actually. I'm really interested. It's obviously a very strong bit of legislation in Wales, which is helping you considerably. I'm just really interested. I live in Cambridgeshire too, but a very different part of Cambridgeshire. I live in the Fens, the northern part, and work and represent that area. Land values are low, house values are low, and developers often struggle to make a profit. So I'm just interested in your experience. Have you got anywhere in Wales where that is similar, and how has this requirement to build SUDs into any new developments impacted on developers, and what was their initial reaction to it? I can imagine they were trying to throw their toys out of the pram. And what was the argument that you held, and has it had an impact on development going forward in these areas of lower land values?
Yeah, I think initially a lot of the large housing developments rushed in to get their applications in 2 weeks before the legislation came in. So the larger developments have only just started coming through the last 12, 18 months, because other ones tried to get in before, which I think was a little naive, because they spend a lot more time going through planning conditions than they do for the SAB application. I think in areas, say the upland valleys, they're quite poor communities in the former mining valleys. In the South Wales valleys, they're quite steep. The land is difficult to build on. I think the challenges there were there before SUDs, because it was very hard to build on there anyway, because of groundwater issues and flood risk issues, because the only houses you could build are on the side of the hill, which is a marginal post-glacial slope, or on the bottom of the valley, which is a floodplain. So I think part of the challenges are the geography. I think initially there were problems with understanding how to design good SUDs. People would put a lot of permeable paving everywhere and say, oh, this is how to deal with it. It costs you an absolute fortune. And when you start looking at commuted sums, and it's something a colleague raised earlier about management companies, commuted sums, how do you adopt and manage? You should allow for all options to do, because certain locations are suited by commuted sums, and maybe certain locations are suited by having management companies. Let's try to come up with solutions. And what we're trying to do in Wales now is publish what's called a commuted sums calculator that will be given to every local authority, and they have their version of it. And by doing that, the developers will know up front what the commuted sums would be to build houses in that area. Because if they're developing, they need to know at the very start of the development what the costs are, not at the very end. So we're trying to adapt our legislation. We had a big review last year with about 85 recommendations to try and improve our legislation to make it clearer and easier to use. And the first people to have that were DEFRA. I passed it over to them to help with their work on the English legislation. So, because they can learn the lessons that we've learned, the hard yards. So hopefully it'll be easier for England to implement. Yeah, it can be challenging in marginal areas, but you've got to work early with the developer to come up with a workable location. What you shouldn't do is have poor design for poor housing. It's the first thing I said to a developer that really annoyed me, when they said, oh, we can't put these such things in council house development, they'll do this, that, and the other. I said, you do exactly what you do for any other development. If you don't, you will not build a house here. I expect to see quality of life and quality of SUDs for housing, whether it's worth $1 million or worth 100 grand. That's a consistency is important, and this legislation demands it. If you don't build to that standard, but it doesn't have to be expensive. Keep it on the surface. As soon as you start going in the ground, the options go down and the price goes up. Keep it on the surface as long as you can.
Thank you. It's really helpful.
Cambridge City and South Cambs have a planning policy requirement for SUDs drainage on all of the housing schemes coming forward, all the schemes coming forward as well. So Bruce, would you like to ask a question or make a point?
Yeah, a very quick one. Thank you, Ian. We have a problem locally where it seems that some of the developers aren't connecting the surface water drainage to the SUDs. So the swales are getting less of the flow and the combined sewer is getting more of the flow. Who checks the connection in Wales?
In Wales, there would be a supervisor from the SAB, and also any connection relating to the water company would be checked by the water company and would be done pre-SAB and should be done now. So the Welsh Water or Having Cymru with the element of Severn Trent that works in Wales would check that and work in close coordination with the SAB. They have a statutory consultee of the SUDs. So if a SAB application goes in, the water company is a statutory consultee, and NRW, our version of the Environment Agency, is also a statutory consultee. So they're both involved with the application and made aware of the application, and you spend a lot of time on the phone with the water company, and you'd have your inspector supervisor as well. And to be honest, when applicants realise that actually a supervisor is there to help, not to police, they actually help you with the installation, then generally you have good work. If you don't check, bad things happen with drainage. Now, that's the same with SAB as it is currently in England. I think in the industry, we all know that. If people know you're not looking, self-certification is not a good idea with drainage. Unless it's a rural area where you can do cameras and photos and videos, that's fine. But in an urban area, don't allow self-certification.
Brilliant, thank you.
I know in Cambridge, the Cambridge City we are taking on the adoption of SUD's drainage system. So we have our own drainage engineer, looking at the as-built SUD's system, because it's, as Ian's saying, it's so important to make sure it is working. And also as taking on the maintenance, we want to make sure it's actually built in accordance to the design and that the design was right. Now, Sue, you've got some questions in the chat. Do you want to pick those up?
So I just saw one from Ryan N. Just one I'd quite like to clear out of the way. Do we see any incentive for SUDs employing vertical spaces in dense urban areas like green walls or rooftop gardens, instead of deploying on the lateral or ground surfaces that are often restricted by land constraint? I just wondered, Ian, what your thought on green roofs and walls are.
I think green roofs in the right location are excellent, and green and blue roofs, if you can manage it. You generally put those in where the development density is so tight there's no opportunity to put them on the surface. So a green blue roof in that situation is excellent. It gives you the biodiversity. You can't enjoy it as much. People walking past can't enjoy it, but it still slows the flow, adds to biodiversity. But if I had a building that had space around it, I put the SUDs on the surface rather on the roof. The reason why I do that is because the community that work and live there can enjoy it. So it's trying to get the balance, because often, pardon me, I'm in the kitchen. Because often in an urban environment, on a roof, you'll get a lot of air conditioning and stuff. And actually what you get these days, you get a lot of PV installations. So we have had systems that are green roof and PV in tandem, but generally in very, very densely populated areas. Green walls are great as long as you get the installation right. There are some cowboys out there designing green wall systems that look good for 6 months and are completely useless. There are some very, very good companies out there, but some very bad companies out there. So it's getting the right installation for the right wall, the right watering system. We're very good in managing air pollutants. They're very good in cooling and buildings, but possibly in terms of SUDs, not as effective. But I'd certainly say green roofs in the right instances are excellent choices.
Katie, I sort of tried to list the questions for you. Now I'm trying to find. Oh, here they are. One of them was going back a bit. There was quite a lot of discussion, wasn't there, about rainwater harvesting and how to make this work?
Yeah.
People were sort of saying that they had never managed to persuade any developer to take it on. Do you do it at site scale, housing scale? What do you do?
If you build a housing development, say 100 houses, you get charged between £5,000 and £7,000 a house for a rainwater garden system, because basically you'd have a tank in the ground with a pump and a filter. The cost benefit analysis of that in somewhere that's got fairly high rainfall, like the west coast of the UK, is probably not there. When you start going towards the east coast, where the rainfall is lower and the water supplies are more limited for new developments, generally I signed them off for things like hotels, laundrettes, places like that have a large grey water use, continuous grey water use. The issues are with the cost benefit. If you put them in a housing estate in a house in West Wales, the money saved would not even cover the cost of maintenance for the tank, because the filters have to be cleaned regularly. You have to be checked for Legionnaire's disease. There are lots of risk assessments with them. But I think, I definitely, for industrial complexes, for new hotels and things like that, they should be an absolute must. But again, it's about the maintenance of the tanks and the filters. But things like gardens, having a rainwater tank in the garden, all new houses should have those as a mandatory. It costs nothing. It can be built really well and robustly. it costs nothing, and people it's the norm for people then. I think things like that we should be doing already, but they are not as cost effective as people think they are in many parts of the UK, because they are expensive to install and difficult. They're not easy to maintain.
So has there's Sue Illman's got her hand up. I see Katie.
Sue, do you want to come?
You're muted.
I'm going to get a difficult question now. I know that if it's Sue Illman. She's still muted. I'm getting away with it.
Actually, I wasn't going to ask you a direct question, Ian. It was more that I was just looking through the chats and noticing some stuff about, I don't know if anybody's talked about it, about getting the SUDS policy in England. I missed the earlier part, so I don't know if that's been discussed.
Just to give you an update, I am in regular touch with DEFRA on this.
Yeah,
and
me too.
I'm hoping, I haven't been told, but I'm hoping a consultation is soon going to go out on the legislation. Fingers and legs crossed that's going to happen. It's really tight, to be honest, between now and the next election to get the statutes through Westminster. It's going to be incredibly tight, but I'm hoping with a new minister in now, Mr. Barclay, and a new emphasis and the opportunity's taken. I know how desperate DEFRA are to deliver it, and you know, I keep thinking of the people in England who helped us deliver it several years ago in Wales, and I think it was I owe you one now. It's paid back in Wales to try and help England to get over the touchline, because all England need to do is get over the start line with this legislation, and the knowledge in England to deliver this, it's not a problem. We just need to get it over the start line. But it's going to be tight between now and the next election, Sue. I'm fingers crossed that it's going to get through in time.
I mean, have they changed their thinking? Because the idea was that, having done all the work, that it would be going out for consultation now in anticipation of it being policy this time next year.
I think that's still the hope. I haven't had any direct confirmation from DEFRA, but that's certainly what I'm hoping, that there will be consultation ASAP, and people are really constructive in their responses, because hopefully they've learned an awful lot from what we've learned. So hopefully a lot of the questions will be already answered, but obviously it's dependent on where people want to place the SAB, who's going to take on the role of the SUDS approval body. That's a big call.
Yeah.
And then them having the knowledge as well as resources to deliver that service, that is for me the key challenge.
And so another one for you in particular is, if you could change anything in the Welsh policy now, knowing what you do, now you've been living with it, what would you change?
I think I would have done, I would have delayed it to have far more training for the SABs and for the applicants before it started. I think we all jumped off a cliff on day one. I don't think we realised the implications of the legislation. It was easy for me. I'm a drainage engineer. You know, I live the dream with drainage. You know how I am. So you have to tell me to shut up because you talk about it too much. But a lot of people were put in a situation where they didn't have the background knowledge to use the legislation, and I think that was a difficult learning curve to create the career pathways for people in the industry. You know, this is part of the climate crisis, SUDS, and we need a 10-year plan to get people trained up for the climate crisis. We do it for a nuclear power station, but we're not doing it for the climate crisis. You know, the industry needs to get a grip, and politicians need to get a grip and get people trained up in all the areas and sectors. We need to be trained up, both public and private sector, because at the moment, the UK construction industry is relying on offshoring loads of engineers. For political reasons, we can't go to Europe to get any. We haven't got enough ourselves. You know, we shouldn't be in this situation. We need to get a training program, a 10-year program to train people up for the climate crisis. That would be my biggest wish. It's long term. It's not overnight, but we need to do it.
Yeah, agree.
We've got to make it an inspiring profession, and something that people really want to do. At the moment, we're having a struggle, aren't we, getting younger people inspired to go into construction and all these things which are just so critical for the future.
Ecologists, landscapers, tree officers, more tree officers, please.
More planners, please.
Yep.
I think we've got about 40 minutes now for an open discussion. So if any, I know there's quite a lot of questions in the chat. People have made questions in the chat. Many have been already answered in comments. So if we've missed your question or comment, please put your hand up and do come back, because we'd like to open it up, the discussion, to all of the experts and the presentation that we've had today. We've heard about new information and data, working with farmers and pilot projects and SUDS and maintenance. My take on the presentation is that it is about working with people, residents and stakeholders is really key to the success of projects. And we need to learn from projects all over the country. Design for climate change, retrofitting can work, and trees are multi-beneficial. So I'm interested in what we've all got from all of the presentations. So perhaps we can broaden it now and put your digital hand up if you want to have a say, or add more questions into the comments. So Hannah Griffin, do you want to come in? You're still on mute, Hannah.
While Hannah's sorting her thing out, there was quite a couple of quite interesting questions. One was from Quinton Carroll. Are you there, Quinton? It was to do with land to biodiversity, yes, rather than food. Yeah. Do you want to put your question before I mangle it?
Yeah, it's this use of agricultural land for something that doesn't have a primary purpose of agriculture. And we found that particularly with things like developing habitat banks or off-site BNG opportunities, landowners, there's a problem with the interpretation of inheritance tax under Treasury rules. And fundamentally, the status of that land changes. And it's putting a lot of the traditional family landowners off because they don't know if they'll lose the inheritance tax benefits of agricultural land. And I was just wondering whether land used for NFM projects was also encountering the same issues, or whether it's still deemed to be primarily an agricultural use and therefore still gets the tax advantages.
I think that's for Amanda. Can you answer that?
Not completely. I know that the Rivers Trust were responding to a recent consultation about changes to the inheritance tax rules, I believe, on that specific point. But I'm afraid I don't know the detail. Apologies.
I know it's something that the DEFRA are trying to sort out with Treasury. So I guess provided it's being looked at.
It is, yeah.
In an outside government, then we can try and resolve it. Thank you.
Hannah, have you been able to unmute? I can see your unmute, you've got your unmute sign, but we can't hear you. Maybe Sue Illman, did you have your hand up again? Do you want to come in? No, okay. Bruce, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, please, just to say a quick word on behalf of communities. Communities include the landowners, and none of this work will happen without landowner agreement. So we live in an area where there's been no natural flood management, even though we flood and we have almost the lowest woodland cover in the UK. So what we did as a community group was to learn from others like Slow the Flow and Corderdale and elsewhere, and get on and make it happen, because all of the specialists in our area are substantially underfunded. They don't have the staff. So what we found is through community enthusiasm and engagement, and through friends of friends, we've actually been able to instigate 12 natural flood management schemes with landowner approval, which has excited the landowners and excited the specialists from the Environment Agency and the Rivers Trust, and has attracted funding. Now, none of this would have happened without community involvement and our friends of friends creating opportunities. And this very often is completely neglected by all these specialists, because You know, their job is to do the technical work and come up with the recommendations and then present it to the community. No, we need to work the other way around. We've got to start with the community, get people excited about the opportunities, and then bring in and engage the specialists. So I'm just shouting for the communities, and also want to emphasise the benefit of our Natural Flood Management UK Facebook group, which is for communities to self-help each other, because at the end of the day, it's our risk, it's our properties that are flooded, it's our costs, not the specialists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Hannah put her question in the chat, and now I've, oh yes, Hannah says she's asked about health and safety and SUDS, particularly in relation to children and play. Ian, I don't know whether you can answer that.
Katie,
Yeah.
the question a little bit earlier, Hannah mentioned that ROSPA, I'm not sure who they are, ROSPA, has new requirements to have fencing around play areas near to SUDS. And so that's the context for her question.
Yeah, well, every time I've signed off any SUDS features, particularly where there's standing water, I always get ROSPA, the Royal Society of Protective Accidents, to sign it off. They're very, very good, very quick and reasonable in their interpretation. They use a traffic light system. So particularly when we design water features around new schools, they're excellent at those. Most rain gardens are not water features. Most rain gardens are as dry as a sandpit. And if you design, you should design them shallow enough so they're not a risk factor. And in Grangetown, there's 107 rain gardens. I'm not aware to this date of a single insurance claim going in for someone tripping over one. So you can design for safety and minimize risk. And there's 20 years of people doing that. So, but ROSPA are great for water features. I'd use them every time.
That's great. Thank you very much. Bill, do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah. Hi to everyone. Ian, you are, I think, a relatively rare beast in being an engineer who gets SUDS. You know, you've been saying it all the way along, keep it on the surface and so on. We are slowly beginning to make connections with like-minded engineers, but they're very few and far between. And I would say, you know, 95, it seems to us anyway, 95% of engineers are advising their clients basically to maintain the status quo. And if they give any concession to SUDS at all, it's in the form of attenuation, so plastic tanks in the ground, or a pond or crater at the end of a pipe, and very familiar problems. Do you get any sense that the civil engineering profession is recognizing that it needs to change the kind of advice that it gives to clients, and is actually doing something about that in terms of the training that it is giving right from the start for civil engineers?
As it's been recorded, and I'm a member of the ICF, be very careful what I say, don't I? I would say it's like turning a super tanker, trying to get our industry to change. In Wales, it's slightly easier because we have statutory legislation. You can't value engineer out green SUDS, you just don't build. So I'd say things are changing slowly here. No, I think the industry is too slow to change. As it is, it's too slow to train people with new ideas. As I put on the chat, to get a civil engineering degree, you don't need to do drainage. It's not mandatory. So you've got a lot of structural engineers coming out with master's degrees in the UK universities and colleges, and very clever people, and they go to the consultants and they say, what do you know about drainage? Absolutely nothing. So the consultants are offshoring. Hundreds and hundreds of engineers are working in India for UK consultants because they can't get anyone trained in the UK. So no, I think the IC and others are too slow. I think they need to turn their heads around very, very quickly. And I think the climate crisis is coming at us so fast, and we're not reacting. And I'm doing everything I can in Wales to change things. And I'm up to London, to Great George Street next week to step on a few toes to talk to the Association of Drainage Authorities on Schedule 3 and this very issue. And I have my usual chat about, A civil engineer sounds like an engineer who's quite polite. If you go into a sixth form, no one will know what a civil engineer is. If you call it climate change engineer, they'll all be signing up. We need to change the perception, and we need to do it now. We're too slow.
Yeah, and I think it's probably fair to say we need to do exactly the same in the landscape industry as well. I'm sure Sue would agree. We need more happening in terms of training for SUDS.
I need half my work is working with landscape architects. We desperately need their input. I'm not a landscape engineer. I'm a civil engineer. I know my limits.
Okay.
Could I jump in and give food for hope, or whatever you call it? I'm on the Teach the Future Adult Advisory Board, and these kids are really steaming ahead with their climate education bill in the House of Commons, and they've got a huge sort of get together at St George's House, Windsor, where they're trying to get all the regulatory bodies to actually wake up to what actually professions and everybody else needs to do in order to be actually fit to practice going into the future. So we need to sort of put our thing behind them, because they're making more progress than we're getting any of our professional institutions to move on. That's just my little word of encouragement.
Thank you for that. Now we've got Helen John. Do you have your hand up? Do you want to come in, Helen?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, I second all of what Bill just said. I've just had a bit of a nightmare trying to get a developer to take on board all of that, and I agree a bit. I think it's a bit of an educational thing with civil engineers. So that's good, Sue, that there's hope there. My question was particularly about flood management schemes. I'm not quite sure who this is best aimed at. But I've been working with a community group. I don't want to name any names because I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But part of this flood management scheme includes channeling floodwater through previous landfill site where there's uncontrolled waste. So it would have been closed in the 70s and 80s. So think back to the kind of stuff they were dumping in back then. Pretty grim. The concern I have is my background. I'm a landscape architect, but my background is also in geochemistry, and so I've got first-hand experience of what happened, obviously in parts of Wales, which Ian will relate to, when a lot of the mines down there failed. My concern is that there's not enough kind of geochemical input when it comes to looking at these flood management schemes, that they're relying on modern channeling through these landfill sites. And I just feel as though there's a catastrophic environmental disaster waiting to happen in order to relieve the necessary relief, as one of the attendees has said, to relieve flooding of properties, which is needed throughout London, but the cost of that could be pollution of our rivers and streams and major water bodies, simply through failing of these channels. I'm very, very concerned about this, and I just would welcome anyone's views on this, and if there are any sort of checks and balances in place.
So, Pete, do you have an answer to that?
No would be the quick answer, but I'll have a quick look through some of the research if I find anything in the meantime.
Or Ian, would you like to comment on that, or Amanda?
I used to be a landfill engineer, so I suppose I should comment on it, shouldn't I? Joys of being a local government engineer. If you've got contaminated land and water, you try and keep the two separate, because you don't want to create contaminant pathway either way. If you always line, you have welded liners, not taped liners, to make sure they're absolutely sealed. You probably put clay underneath to make sure it's doubly sealed. You really try and avoid putting any flow path through on contaminated waste. Very last resort, because it's the risk. And you'd have to do what's called a PQA check on any lining you did in relation to that, because the two must be completely segregated. But it's difficult at places like London, where most land is contaminated to some level or another. It's about remediating the contamination, capping it off, and or sealing. With most urban areas with such features, because we got glacial boulder clay mostly anyway, we line everything, because there's no worries about highways being undermined, there's no worries about groundwater getting in, there's no worry about contaminants, no worries about cellars, because you get evapotranspiration even from the soil and the vegetation, and you get very little infiltration anyway. So it basically segregates the water to be cleansed from the rest of the environment. So you manage it within a treatment train, as it's called in the SUDS manual, and it's lined and managed within that treatment train. So it's segregated from everywhere else. So you manage the contaminants that you're collecting within your own space and your own treatment train, and you try not to involve any other land runoff whatsoever, whether it's clean or not. So without wanting to comment on a specific case, you'd want to keep the two very separate.
Yeah, thanks very much. Agree with all that. There's still not any clear solution though, and it's a massive worry for the communities down there.
Well, yes, it makes you understand how you can, as you say, SUDS can be a simple system on a surface next to one house, or take it to that great big macro level that could have a major effects on a development. Sue, would you like to come in next?
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I was really just wanting to pick up on what was being said about training. I mean, clearly there's a huge amount of training that needs to be done. And I think quite a few of the institutions may well not be doing as much as they could. But I'm continually surprised at how much is known by people. It has grown exponentially, the number of people who have got involved. They may not all be as well versed in good practice as they should be, but I think that awareness is there. It's within the developer community as well. Again, I think they look for the solutions that they see, the ones that tend to be more traditional, you know, as in it's the dreaded pipe to pond solution rather than true SUDS. But even they are softening up to it. So I think we are heading in the right direction. I agree there is a huge amount of training still to do, but I feel quite hopeful actually, because people are happy to share their thinking. I think there's good material out there. We need to get more out there. We need to communicate it better. Syria and SciWem are both running training courses and have done for a long time. I teach SUDS construction for them, but you need 100 people teaching it probably for the numbers we've got. But I think I don't think we should feel too it's not anxious. I think you've got to be realistic about it. It is going to take time to spread, but once we start getting that requirement coming through from the planning system, I think it will sharpen people's attention to the fact that if they're going to be putting in planning applications and providing that information, then they really need to understand about this better. And there will be a huge galvanizing of that, I think, of that learning. And we just need to, try and make sure that the best information is out there so that people are learning good practice and not, either inappropriate solutions or ones that are not delivering across quality, quantity, amenity and biodiversity. So yeah, just perhaps a different point of view, a different perspective on it.
Thank you, Sue. Because in Cambridge we have a planning requirement for SUDS drainage on all schemes. It hadn't occurred to me that it wasn't across the whole of England. Yeah, and it really needs to come in quickly, I think.
Katie, I can't manage to put a yellow hand up, so I'm just
okay. Sue, come in.
So two things came to mind. Well, three things now. So Cambridge, it was really interesting when we did our Milton Road thing, because the person who was then in charge of SUDS said we're going to have SUDS because our other systems have no further capacity, which I think has been quite an interesting driver there. But I had a question for Amanda, which is, you've been dealing a lot with landowners, obviously trying to engage them to get them. Are they sort of seeing the benefits of natural flood management to an extent that they're supporting what's trying to be done, or are they still seeing do they have a resistance because it kind of seems a diversion from what they want to be doing with their land?
I think you've just got to make it work for their business. So, if you're going to take 3/4 of a farmer's land away to plant trees on it, you have to compensate them for that loss of income and loss of, going forward. So it's like somebody coming into your house and saying, I'm going to rent one of your rooms out, but you can't use it, and I'm not going to give you any compensation for the loss of it. you know. So yeah, farmers understand that the way that land is managed has an impact downstream. And, you know, a lot of farmers are very, you know, their identity is really tied up with that land and they want to do the right thing for it, but they've got to make it a business as well. They've got mortgages to pay and bills to pay the same as everybody else. So, you know, if you're going to lose, I don't know, £70 an acre from lost grazing income for the next 25 years or 50 years because we put trees on it, then you have to give them some kind of compensation from that. You can't just expect people to do it for free, can you? So yeah, I think that's where the gap is.
What is it we expect farmers to do, Amanda? Do we expect them to become foresters if we're taking their land away?
I think there's perhaps a misconception that NFM can just happen everywhere. And then, well, what would happen to our food production system? So, you know, we'd be increasingly reliant on exports from outside of the UK. There is marginal land, like I said, that are soggy corners that aren't productive. And those are the bits that we're focusing on in our project, because those are the bits where landowners are willing to do something where they can't really use it anyways. So if we can find enough of those soggy corners and wet bits collectively, and then we get some changes in our kind of agricultural policies that encourage that kind of thing going forward, then that would be great. But in the past, agricultural subsidies have encouraged production over anything else, including, you know, draining land, straightening rivers, set stocking densities, which compacts the land and reduce, you know, increases runoff. So yeah. It's a change that we need, just like you guys were talking about with the drainage engineering skills. You know, it takes time to make those changes and to implement a different approach and to get all the policy and the funding set up to support that as well.
Thank you, Amanda. Pete, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to join in on that point, Amanda, about in terms of farming and natural flood management. So a lot of schemes in the Lake District, some of the larger scale wetlands, we're just looking at ways in which that can be commercialized. So rather than just saying, you know, we want this field that's very marginal grazing land because it's flooded so often anyway, and it's actually creating a huge risk for cattle. So it's removing actually some of the potential losses for farmers in terms of crop losses and animal losses in those extreme weather events, but it's also creating new opportunities. So one of the things we looked at was ecotourism. So like putting boardwalks around this new wetland system and having areas for campsite, because actually a lot of people wanted to come and see these new features, and they are features, and it relates back to the green space provision. The schemes can do it all. And a lot of the farms we're talking about in upland areas, for those who aren't familiar with this farming system, they're hundreds of hectares in a single farm run by a single family, often one person. So we're not talking about stripping away all of our valuable farmland and not growing food. We're talking about repurposing marginal land that's actually creating potential issues in terms of if you've invested a lot of money growing a crop and then the whole field floods at the wrong time and you've lost it, that's a lost investment. So would that field be better put to use as a wetland system, as a new wet woodland? And then it might even protect other land from flooding by becoming a water sink in itself. So it's certainly not farming versus trees or farming versus water management. I think we can have it all. It's just about combining them into a system that meets all of our aims.
Yeah, I'll just come in to say about the uplands as well. So the moorlands and the peat bogs, which have been very mismanaged in my opinion, and they are contributing an awful lot to our flood risk due to the state that they're in. And we've spent, you know, collectively, there was a lot of EU money spent on restoring peat bogs. Water companies have spent huge amounts of, like, multiple millions of pounds in restoring these habitats back to the way that they should have been. And the reason they're in that state is because policy has driven landowners to manage them in a particular way, and we're now asking those habitats to be managed in a very different way. And obviously there is also the shooting lobby that is quite powerful, so there's that to contend with as well.
Yeah, Amanda, do all the things that you and Peter talk about in the uplands, will that apply to the very flat lands we have around Cambridge and all the farming and the kind of straightened water courses? Because we have flooding as well as drought problems here.
I imagine it's even more of an issue in terms of loss of income for farmers in lowland areas. So your farmers will be earning a lot more because they're arable than upland farmers will. So the rates of compensation that they will need in order to give that land up to natural flood risk management will be higher. There's also internal drainage boards that are largely responsible for flood risk management in those lowland areas. And their raison d'etre is to get water off farmland and away as quickly as possible. And they're actually a really key player in trying to kind of change their approaches a bit and encourage a more NFM kind of focused approach to how we manage IDBs.
Thank you. Thank you.
And on that, sorry, I was just going to quickly say on that point again, because I used to work in the Fenlands as well in nature conservation, and yeah, the huge issue is like with the perch water courses. So from the digging of peat, the water courses are now above the farmland in most places. So it's actually much more of a risk than in the uplands in many cases. So I think this makes it even more valuable to restore the wetlands where you can, because that creates the storage area to protect the farmland elsewhere. You can't possibly maintain it all as farmland because the water has to go somewhere. It's above the farmland. So I think the wetland systems actually, although you're losing more valuable farmland, you're actually protecting far more valuable farmland in the long run.
And carbon capture.
Yeah.
Bill, do you want to come in, and then Quintin afterwards?
Yeah, just to pick up on this point about where NFM can happen. We a number of people know we're running an NFM project in East Yorkshire called West Wolds Slow the Flow. So we're on the west flank of the Yorkshire Wolds, all chalk streams, or nearly all chalk streams, just incredible habitats in their own right. And what we've found is that the places where we're starting to gain traction do tend to be landowners who have corners or fields that they graze, not intensively. They're not particularly concerned about the potential changes to the water regime or improvements as we would see it. And through developing those and exploring the ideas with those landowners, we're starting to get examples that we can then show to other landowners. And the real thing is, I think, about being involved in the project for long enough that you have enough time to start to gain momentum. And the longer we're doing it, the more we can connect with other people, the more people connect with us, and opportunities arise. So I think it's just a long game, basically. That's the problem. But from not being sure what we were starting in 2020 to now developing 4 different projects around the catchment and having more conversations in the pipeline, I think things are looking very positive. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Bill. Really good points. Quintin?
Yeah, thanks. Just come back on this difference in agricultural productivity that we see, and you're absolutely right. I mean, for colleagues who don't know, I'm head of Natural Historic Environment Service at Cambridge County Council, and this whole challenge and almost potential conflict between land use on high value agricultural land, particularly flat high value agricultural land, is something we have a big problem with in the east of England. But it's one of the reasons why the Food Farming Countryside Commission selected Cambridgeshire to be a pilot area for one of these land use frameworks, which is where they're trying to say what is the optimal use of a land for multiple benefits, whether that's NFM, biodiversity, renewable development, all of these different or food, because we have to use our land intelligently and not rush to try and think, well, we need this, we'll put it there, when it might not be the best place. That might not be the best location for that. So we kind of need that information base, that intelligence base, to help us make those decisions as to what we use our land for, and to balance with all these different pressures. And it's a real challenge, particularly when your agricultural land is of high value.
Yes, really well. Very, very important points, Quintin. Thank you. Sue, did you want to say anything, and then I'll ask the panelists to maybe make one more point each, and then before we wrap up.
Yes, I just actually quickly thought, when is the Food Farming Countryside Commission report, or when's the pilot likely to be completed? Because I think it's becoming quite urgent that we get some of these things going in place, because particularly as we're trying to persuade DEFRA and DLUC that we need a really proper land use framework for England, which we're completely lacking. I just wondered what the time schedule is.
The sort of initial development work on it has ended, and there's kind of a beta product, which I've had a couple of meetings with Dame Fiona and the others, the FFCC, to try and understand what we do with it next. Where does it go? So we're still wondering whether we can pick it up as part of our LNRS work, because obviously LNRS is another major pressure on land use, and we're wondering whether there's a home there to move a land use framework to help inform LNRS, or to have a wider application. So that's where we're currently exploring the possible overlaps.
Yes, and I would very much like to consider the land use framework as integrating with local plans, actually use it to inform local plans. Okay, so I'll just go back to the panelists to see if there's any other point that they would like to make, but maybe didn't get time to make. Pete, do you want to say anything else?
I think the discussion we've pretty much covered it all, which it all comes full circle to multiple benefits from the offset. And yeah, trying to think outside of the siloed working, and actually think maybe we could slightly reduce the benefit we want to see, but massively increase other benefits to increase the net benefit to society, rather than thinking purely in terms of a business thinking about finance, environmental charity thinking about environmental benefits, trying to have a bit of everything.
Thank you. Amanda?
No, just thank you for the invite to speak to you all today. It's really encouraging to see such a large community of people really passionate about driving forward blue-green infra. So yeah, it's just good to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian?
No, it's always a pleasure to share ideas and experiences. I'm always learning from these opportunities, and I'm really looking forward to England getting Schedule 3. It's going to liven things up across the border, but we can do everything we can to help our colleagues in England to share the experiences. And it's a change. It'll change everything. It's a game changer. It's statutory SUDS. It'll change people's attitudes to water and management of water, and they see it as an asset and not as a threat. And that's where we need to be with water.
Well, and that's it, everyone. I'd like to thank our panelists and organisers, Sue, Emma and Dee, and also the sponsors of this event. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and the recording will be shared on the TDAG YouTube channel soon. So thank you very much, everyone.
So thanks, everybody. And our next seminar is in December, and it'll be on the cost of tree planting. You can find that on our events page. And I will go through this chat, which I'm about to save, and so that all the references people have given will be put on the website as well under past events. And thank you, Katie, for chairing so brilliantly, and everybody for taking part, and everybody for attending.
Yeah.